This is Peace Arch Park, located on the international boundary between Washington State and British Columbia. In September of 1964, a large crowd of Canadian and American citizens gathered here for an historic ceremony. Its purpose was to formalize the largest international resources agreement ever concluded between Canada and the United States. It was called the Columbia River Development Treaty. Now, more than 3 decades later, there is still controversy over the consequences and the costs.
The main focal point of this event was the handing over to Canada of a check amounting to about $250 million. The money was advance payment to British Columbia for certain benefits realized by the Americans from the building of 3 dams in Canada. This ceremony signified that construction of those 3 dams in the Canadian portion of the Columbia Basin could now begin. The 3 dams built in Canada were the Duncan Dam on a tributary of Kootenay Lake, the High Arrow or Keenly Side Dam on the Columbia River near Castlegar, and the Mica Dam on the upper Columbia River north of Revelstoke. A 4th dam was built on the Kootenay River at Libby, Montana, and it created a reservoir 60 kilometers long in Canada. The Duncan Dam was completed in 1968. The Hugh Keenly Side Dam was completed in 1969. The Mica Dam was completed in 1973. Those 3 Canadian dams made possible greatly increased power production in the Columbia Basin and provided a quite wide margin of flood control. But the BC reservoirs flooded thousands of hectares of highly productive bottomland in the Kootenays. A 4th valley was flooded by the Libby Dam in Montana, whose reservoir backed up 60 kilometers into Canada. Since the 3 treaty dams were built, additional dams have been placed at Revelstoke Canyon on the Columbia River just north of the town, at 7 Mile on the Pend Oreille River near the international boundary, and the Kootenay Canal project was installed on the Kootenay River south of Nelson. In all, a total of 6 power projects have been built on the Columbia River system within Canada in the last 30 years. The Canadian portion of the Columbia River now provides 50% of all the electric power generated in British Columbia. Having a large storage reservoir in the upper reaches of a major river is one of the surest ways to get maximum power efficiency. Here at Mica Dam, the annual spring runoff is held in the reservoir each year. This dam alone provides 1/5 of BC's electric power. But the Mica Dam also creates huge power benefits downstream. This is how that works. About 100 kilometers downriver, the same water which produced power at the Mica Dam falls through a second set of generators at the Revelstoke Dam. All the rest of the way down the Columbia River, this happens again and again. As the water stored in Canada is released, it generates increasing amounts of power as it passes through a dozen or more dams on its way to the sea. Most of those dams are in the United States. Payment for downstream benefits was part of the Columbia Treaty package. The United States got half the power generated by Canadian dams, and they paid us in advance for a period of 30 years. Another kind of downstream benefit to building headwater dams is flood control. A disastrous flood occurred on the Columbia River in 1948. But the Canadian dams now provide much increased flood protection by holding back part of the spring runoff until the flood threat is past. Under the treaty, the United States pays British Columbia for providing this flood control. The main disadvantage to hydroelectric power is that the reservoirs created by the dams occupy large areas of valley bottom land, a very scarce resource in mountainous BC. Lakes and rivers converted to storage reservoirs now occupy approximately 300 lineal miles or 500 kilometers of valley bottom in the Columbia Basin in Canada. Treaty reservoirs have flooded forests, farmland, and human settlement. Environmental losses to fish and wildlife have been severe. Because the reservoirs are drawn down and refilled each year, many of these losses are permanent. More on that later. The annual rise and fall of reservoir levels is one of their most disagreeable features. Some reservoirs are empty for a good part of the year, showing unsightly stumps and mudflats when wet, and annoying dust storms when dry. In summer, when snowmelt has provided enough water to fill the reservoirs, they can be aesthetically quite pleasing. But the main reason for containing the water is to use it for the generation of hydroelectric power. In order to achieve that, it is necessary to fill the reservoirs every spring and draw them down again as the electricity is required. For those in the marina business, the length of the season is determined by the power demand, which in turn determines how fast the reservoirs rise and fall.
We have like 9.5 or 10 months of sand and dust. We don't have water.
It is true that hydro dams do not emit any chemical pollutants, smoke, or contaminated water, but we have learned that building dams and reservoirs invariably results in widespread and lasting environmental damage. And then there are the social impacts. More than 2,000 people were forced to leave their homes to make way for the new reservoirs. Under the terms of the treaty, this movement of people had to occur within a very short time frame. The deadlines were not negotiable. Because no public hearings were ever held, residents were poorly informed and had been given no say in a massive construction project that was sure to change their lives. Many of the people who lived through those days describe a callousness of treatment that is almost impossible to believe.
They were very trusting people here. So when the negotiators came in, and they went from house to house, almost threatening them, this is what you get, this is the last offer you're going to get, you have to go, whether it was old people or young people, this is the way they were treated.
I don't think they really registered with the people as to what was going to happen until the time came that they start demolishing the countryside with it. And I think then it sunk in that disaster was upon us.
Being at the top of the Libby Reservoir, the Riziki Ranch at Wardner, BC, was one of the last properties to be flooded. Like all valley bottom properties, it was highly productive land. Along with hundreds of others, the Riziki family were forced to relocate to higher ground. And as stated, there were fixed deadlines by which the land had to be cleared, ready for flooding, and these could not be changed. The Riziki buildings were below the maximum flood level, and they had to go. At high water, commonly referred to as full pool, this place would be flooded. At drawdown, the water will be 40 miles away. The site of the Riziki buildings is now defined by a few old concrete foundations. The valleys of the Kootenays were quite remote when the dams were being built. The few residents were very self-reliant people. While most were of quite modest financial means, their properties provided them with a way of life that they had chosen for themselves. Many were overwhelmed by the news that they had to be off their land by a certain time, and they were shocked to find that government negotiators placed a low value on properties that had supported some families for generations. The human stories are the least known of treaty impacts.
I have to agree that if it's good for the majority of the people, that someone has to give up something. But at the same time, I really believe there should be fair compensation and a little more honest dealing.
Gordon Ostrich and his family had a ranch near Waldo, a small town also in the path of the rising Libby Reservoir. Much of Gordon's property was flooded, and he was forced to cease ranching and take up other work. In an interview in 1973, Gordon was asked what it was like trying to deal with government on the subject of property settlement.
Trying to get land as cheap as possible and figure people were just going to grab the money right out of their hands, I suppose. I wouldn't say they were hard to deal with, but they treated you as if you were ignorant. You didn't know what you figured you were a few dollars would just break their arm off for it. This is the attitude they took.
I think all the decisions were made, well, could we use the word in privacy, secret? I mean, there was no consultation with public, not in Revelstoke with regards to mica, or I don't know too much about the Arrow Lakes, but my understanding from over the years that there was no consultation with over there. It was all a decision that was made by the politicians of the day in Victoria.
The provincial government with their property negotiators, they worked on the old people first, the seniors, the tired people. They worked on the people, on older people first, and then went through and then dealt with us hard ones at the end.
The Sharps were another pioneer family in the Kootenai Valley, and they soon learned that most of their property was also going to be flooded. The family resisted. Lloyd attempted to create awareness in the rest of BC of the kinds of things that were happening in the Kootenays. He had some success in getting big city media attention, but it really didn't change very much. There were those firm deadlines we spoke of. A huge and binding commitment had been made, and by the time the full details became known, it was too late to change anything.
I don't think they've been treated fairly.
The reason they never try to settle with us in any way, they just seem to to wear us down. That finally we'd just give in and quit.
There was a sense of great haste through the valleys of the Kootenays during that time. We were building 3 big dams at once, plus the Libby Dam in Montana. The construction work on reservoir clearing went on night and day. The plight of small family farmers seemed pretty insignificant in the midst of such great projects. In the Libby Basin, ranchers were promised land above the floodplain, but in the end, little of that was available, and none so rich as the bottomland, now underwater. Smoke from reservoir clearing and burning homesteads rose over the valleys behind the Libby, Arrow, and Duncan dams. Structures or parts of communities below the high water mark were moved away or burned. Some communities were cut in half. Others completely disappeared. One of the most revealing descriptions of the change is contained in a series of photographs of people and places affected by the great reservoir of the Libby Dam. Photographer Stanley Triggs made yearly trips to the region. The images in his collection stand as sensitive and lasting record of how it was and how it was changed. Triggs captured the unique lifestyle, the independence and self-reliance of the residents. His pictures also offer visual insight into what it used to be and what it finally became.
It was a beautiful valley. It was a pristine valley, and you can't replace these kind of valleys once you destroy them, regardless of whether you flood them, they're gone forever and a day.
The historic little town of Waldo was the center of human settlement in the area to be flooded by the Libby Dam. One building for which people felt real attachment was the 2-story frame school, in which most of the residents had acquired their education. When the government had gained possession of all the private property in Waldo, and the town was emptied of people, and the water was rising behind the Libby Dam, a government clearing crew moved in, and the entire town was burned to the ground in an afternoon.
Recall being there when the school was burnt, yes, and the houses along the riverside, as we call it, being burnt.
Well, I remember my daughter crying that she was losing not only her teacher, her school.
It was rather sad because the raised there, and some of the people seemed to think it was a progress, but like myself and any other people that lived there were making a good living and prospering at what we were doing. We didn't see it as progress. We saw it as a disaster happening.
Some of those people that were still living here were a generation from the people that pioneered there at Waldo. And it's bound to be traumatic for you to see the school that you went to school in and the home that you lived in for all those years burnt up. I guess probably the simplest way to say what it would feel like, I guess it's the end of an era. I mean, it's something that's gone. It's gone forever.
Only one building in Waldo, the community church, was spared. As the water was rising to cover the town site, the church was pulled from below the flood line and relocated on high ground in the nearby community of Baines Lake. There it continues to serve as an interdenominational community church.
So I'll cherish the old rugged cross till my trophies at last I lay down. I will cling to the old rugged cross and exchange
The Waldo Church was originally located on this ridge overlooking the town. Someplace out there were homes, post office, school, hotel, and other buildings. Even the foundations have disappeared, buried by the blowing sand. The very contours have changed, the result of 25 years of wind and waves, and the continuous raising and lowering of the reservoir. Just about exactly where the church once stood, the highest remaining point of land becomes a tiny island when the reservoir rises to full pool, and even this point is gradually being eroded away. Throughout the basin of the Libby Reservoir, the forces of wind and waves are changing the entire shape of the valley floor, and the reservoir banks are finding a new angle of repose. At Wardner, in the spring of 1973, Anton Rizicki, one of the last holdouts, was finally forced to move house with the water rising around him. He was at the top of the reservoir, and his place was about the last to go under. As with many others, negotiations for his land had dragged on for years. In the end, there was no choice but to move. The water was everywhere. The biggest dislocation of people occurred in the Arrow Lakes Valley above the Keenleyside Dam. The Arrow Reservoir backed up some 200 kilometers, displacing hundreds of families. Close to 2,000 residents were moved. Some found a bitter irony in being flooded out permanently so as to provide occasional flood control for people downstream.
The residents of the Arrow Lakes feel that the battle will never be lost until the water comes right over their properties and dooms them to elimination. My particular piece of land that was flooded is probably one of the most valuable pieces of land of farm, and in British Columbia anyhow, we could gross $2,000 an acre per year off that land, all of which is now underwater.
Now, the Oliver Burgers at Burton, they were in the same boat as we were, and they went to court. But of course, Hydro had a whole team of high-priced lawyers, and he lost his case. And it's been a ruined family ever since, and there were others of that sort. I'm just giving you two examples.
But the people in the Arrow Lakes had lived, almost all of them, in that environment at least since the First World War. Many of them were old, and they'd lived there for 40 or more years in small communities. They were intensely conscious of their communities and the environmental surroundings of these communities, living in a very distinctive and sympathetic place. And to destroy that and to move them away from it was a dreadful insult.
On the Arrow Reservoir, unlike some, the forested areas of the valley bottom were cleared before flooding. Even 30 years later, the aftermath appears as an unsightly expanse of thousands of stumps when the reservoir is drawn down. In effect, it is one of the largest clear-cuts in the province. The silt carried by mountain rivers is very fine in texture, almost like flour. When it gets dry, it can become airborne. All natural rivers transport a certain silt load suspended in the water and carried along by the force of the current. On rivers with dams on them, the current nearly stops where the reservoir begins, and the silt particles sink to the bottom. As a result, the silt from a given year is gradually distributed over most of the reservoir area. When the flats are bare and dry, the silt can be picked up by a strong wind. In response to public objection about the dust problems, BC Hydro has undertaken to settle the dust, as it were, by seeding agricultural grass species on the reservoir bottom. Not all the bottom land is accessible for treatment. Some of the old islands are still isolated. But in those areas where the seeding has been successful, the extent and intensity of the dust problem has been much reduced. Standard practice is to clear reservoirs before flooding, but in the case of the Duncan, they put the water in before they took the trees out. Behind the Mica Dam, it was much the same, except that the forest flooded there was much larger. People were enraged at the drowning of these forests. Years after, working when the reservoir was drawn down, fallers completed the dangerous job of clearing the Duncan Reservoir, and some wood was salvaged. The small community of Hauser was located above the Duncan Dam and is now vanished without a trace. When empty,
The Duncan Reservoir is another of those now familiar expanses of gravel ridges, stumps, and dunes. A well-built boat launching ramp does permit anglers to carry out recreational fishing in the drawn-down reservoir. At low water, it's a long ways to the lake. At full pool, the Duncan Reservoir normally rises right to the tree line, but for years after the dam became operational, swimming or boating was next to impossible because of huge rafts of floating debris. Until it was finally cleaned up, years after construction, the task of trying to create a usable beach area was left to local volunteers. The idea that reservoirs would automatically become recreational lakes had little currency among those who actually had to contend with debris problems like this. Prior to the arrival of white people, Native Indians had lived in the productive valley bottoms of the Columbia Basin for centuries. As the water was rising, a small field project was done to try and salvage some of the archaeological record, but the time was short and the flooding schedules could not be changed. Prior to dam building, sea-run salmon used to spawn in many parts of the Columbia Basin in Canada. Long before the Columbia Treaty dams were built, dams on the American side of the border had caused the extinction of the salmon runs into Canada. Thus, Native Indians in both the United States and Canada also became casualties of dam building.
I've seen it down here at the mouth of the river where there's wide, flat, shallow water, you know, and they were so crowded, some of them go along the bank, you could see their backs coming up. Just hundreds of them, thousands of them. By God, they just come and since the Grand Coulee Dam, there hasn't been any fish up here. It was a great loss to us. Of course, you know, progress, they said, was construction of this dam. But it's detrimental to us Indians. It's great loss to us.
Behind all three Canadian dams, wildlife suffered loss of vital habitat due to reservoir flooding. Large mammals like elk and deer were particularly hard hit because traditional valley bottom winter ranges had become barren reservoirs. On an acre-for-acre basis, the biggest wildlife losses of all occurred behind Libby.
Kootenai River was the heart of the southern trench, the heart of the East Kootenai Trench. It was the most productive part of the trench, and it would have carried most of the wintering ungulates, particularly white-tailed deer that go right to the valley floor, and elk as well. We also blocked migration routes, and we don't to this day know what impact that had on species like mule deer or cougar or black bears or some of the smaller animals. We know we lost tremendous numbers of fur bearers, beaver and muskrat, for example, and all of the animals that were associated with them.
The dams work like giant filters. Natural nutrients settle out to the bottom of the reservoir above the dam. Downstream water bodies become so deprived of nutrients as to cause fish populations to crash. The decline of kokanee has been documented by years of annual spawning counts. Both fish numbers and size have declined continuously since the dams were built. To its credit, BC Hydro has been a long-time funder of fish and wildlife compensation programs. Below the Duncan and Libby dams, fertilizer is being applied to Kootenai Lake to raise nutrient levels and restore the fishery. It seems to be working, but will likely have to continue indefinitely. Another victim of the environmental changes is the white sturgeon, now being extensively studied. They live for 150 years or so. They were quite abundant in all the major lakes and rivers before the dams went in. In places, they can still be found in quite good numbers, but a disturbing fact has been revealed. Changes in water flows and temperatures have apparently rendered most spawning ineffective since the dams were built. The populations now are almost entirely comprised of older fish, an ominous discovery.
Well, I don't think any of us understood at that time the enormous impacts of those dams, and it's 30 years later. I don't think we've got the story entirely straight yet, but some of the valley bottoms that I saw that are now underwater, and some of the fisheries resources that were lost as a result of those reservoirs, it's just breathtaking. Just enormously productive river fisheries that are now gone, replaced by reservoirs of various levels of productivity. But certainly today, when you look back and think back on it, it was just unbelievable, the amount of land and the amount of water and rivers in particular that have been lost as a result of those reservoirs.
Drastic social upheaval, an absence of local input into major decisions, and permanent environmental losses. Such is the history of the dam building experience in the Kootenays. But as the years passed, people became aware that an opportunity for public involvement might at last present itself. The viewer will remember that the sale of downstream benefits had a term life of 30 years. As the time drew near, residents of the district resolved that local people should be given more say in matters concerning environmental, economic, and social choices within the Columbia Basin in Canada. The Columbia Basin Trust was created in that spirit.
The Columbia Basin Trust Act was given overwhelming approval by the BC legislature in 1995.
We see the trust operating through the direction of the public. So the trust board of directors looks at themselves as facilitators, doing what the public in this region put forward in the basin plan. They're going to decide as to the priorities of the economy and how to restore that, and the environment and how to restore that. And they're going to be directing us how to implement that. And it's really it's going to be a bottom-up style of return. We didn't involve the people in the process 30 years ago. We want to make darn sure that we involve them in the process now.
The tragic human and environmental impacts of the dam building days are all part of history now. The Columbia Basin Trust is embarking on a program of sustainable development in the Columbia Basin within Canada. It is a regional, open process, very different from before. As you have seen, plenty of physical and emotional scars remain. Those who lived through the dam building experience have no desire to dwell on the past, but they would like it to be remembered. This is Mike Halloran speaking.